Well, I'm going to go ahead and get things started. Welcome to the Baker Institute. This is has been an interesting event to plan. As most of you know, when we, or you can imagine anyway, when we sort of started thinking about doing this event on the Arctic with our partners at the Norwegian consulate, we were thinking that there would be a really interesting and rich discussion about new movement of U.S. Arctic exploration and development. Of course, the wheels sort of came off of that wagon, so to speak. But that doesn't, reduce the importance of discussing Arctic energy issues by any stretch of the imagination, because the Arctic, of course, is larger than just the United States, and there are lots of issues around the world that we have to be concerned about. One of the most prevalent issues when we think about Arctic exploration and development activities is environmental in nature. We think about the Arctic typically as sort of the last sort of untouched frontier. And in a lot of ways it is. And so we have to think about, as we really globally begin to move into this environment, how do we do so in an environmentally responsible way? And so tackling these issues is of the utmost importance, and it's better to be out in front of it than behind it. And certainly today you will hear from some speakers, particularly from Norway, Petroleum Safety Authority, who have been looking at these issues and thinking about how to quantify risks and how to grapple with risks in a pretty unique and interesting way. And I think that these sorts of lessons can bode well around the world as we start to think about Arctic exploration. Why does the Arctic matter? Well, I've actually been quoted in the press as stating it's always the project that's 10 years away. And there's a small anecdote behind that. But when I first finished my graduate education, I went into the industry, and I was involved in a National Petroleum Council study at the time that was published in 2003 on the future of North American natural gas. And of course, one of the big issues in the early 2000s was, what about the Alaska gas pipeline? It was all about, blowing down that 50 TCF gas cap and moving that through Canada, or there was the over-the-top route or the Alaska Highway route, all these different discussions. And through the course of that exercise, it was interesting to actually speak with individuals who had been working on these things for the better part of 25 years. And they joked that every time we model this, we model it as if it's going to happen in 10 years. And so that's where that line comes from. It's always the project that's 10 years away. Really, at the core of this is the Arctic is commercially challenged. And that's just an inescapable fact. Of course, if we were still in a $100 oil price environment, we would probably be viewing Arctic energy development a little bit differently today than we are today. That said, as we move forward, energy demands are going to grow. That's an inescapable fact. And when we look at conventional resource development from places that traditionally have provided the world's energy resources, it's just simply not sufficient to meet projected demands. And so that moves us into thinking about frontier resource domains. Certainly we have borne witness to this domestically here in the United States and North America more generally with shale. That certainly is a frontier resource domain, and there's shale around the world. We think about Deepwater. So this moves us offshore in Brazil, for example, in the pre-salt, or offshore Gulf of Mexico, or other various places around the world where we're really thinking about these new, more technically challenging and difficult domains to produce oil and gas. But the Arctic is certainly right in the middle of that wheelhouse as well. And so we have to think about what that means 10, 15, 20 years down the road as energy demands grow and we continue to see a deeper dive into these sort of new frontiers. And certainly to do this and do it responsibly, we need to be conscious of the environmental impacts of every single one of those ventures. So that's all I'm going to say. Hopefully that sets the stage for a lot of what everybody else here will say. We have some great speakers today. And I'm going to yield the floor now to our partner. He's the Consul General, Norwegian Consul General here in Houston. He's got a very long and pretty decorated history in the Foreign Service in Norway, Morten Paulsen. He's been a great addition to the Consular Corps here in Houston. And I have to say, I was actually commenting on this this before the conference and speaking with Fran, actually, Ulmer, who will be our next speaker. The Consular Corps in Houston has become increasingly active and this is beyond just Norway, it's sort of across the board in thinking about a variety of issues. And I think that really follows from the fact that that activity, particularly in the city of Houston, particularly in the energy space, is really vital to understanding how industry is thinking about issues, because we are, after all, in Houston, in the energy capital of the world. The Norwegian consul has been incredibly active. They actually host lunch and learns, which is actually a pretty fantastic way to think about interacting with members of the Houston business community, and they're very successful in doing this. And certainly under Morten's leadership, that will continue. So Morten, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The world is turning its attention towards the Arctic more than at any time in the past. The Arctic is a region of significant and increasing geopolitical importance. It is key to our ability to understand and manage climate change, and its natural resources offer major opportunities for business development and value creation. Not so good.
You should be able to use that. Did you push that one more time? Very good.
That's better. Norway has a key position in the Arctic. We have generations of experience of managing abundant resources and have thus built up a valuable knowledge that we can bring to the regional and international cooperation. And if you take a look at the map, there is one distinction between Norway and its region compared to other regions, and that is something called the Gulf Stream. That is heated water coming up along the Norwegian coast. That means that the climate in the Norwegian Arctic is milder than the normal would have been on the same latitude around the world. So that means we can almost speak of this as the soft Arctic. That means that we have had people living there for hundreds of years, and there are thriving societies up there. And that means that there are infrastructure in the Norwegian Arctic. That is not the case in the other parts of the Arctic. This, for instance, is Hammerfest, which is on the northern tip of Norway, where this is a normal thriving city, used to be based on fishing. But in the background there you see the LNG export facility for the Snøhvit field. I will come back to that. But that is one, maybe if you should remember one thing from what I've said today, people have been living in the Norwegian Arctic for centuries, and they have gained some experience by doing that. Respect for the law of the sea and international cooperation are crucial for promoting stability and predictability in the North. We have a tradition of responsible marine resource management at the national level, and also have been at the forefront of efforts to put in place international regulations in this area. North Norway is today thriving, and the region offers great potential for value creation. There are local variations, but the overall picture is very positive. Over the past 10 years, the negative population trend in North Norway has been reversed, and people are now moving to this part of the country. Educational institutions, the number of doctorates awarded, industries, innovation and infrastructure, all these are areas currently in state of growth. In the time ahead, Norway will give priority to the following 5 areas: international cooperation, business development, knowledge development, infrastructure, and emergency preparedness and environmental protection. Cross-border cooperation is vital for continued sustainable development in the North. Since 1993, the Barents cooperation between the Nordic countries, Russia, and the European Union has enabled the countries involved to work together in a number of areas. This cooperation ranges from people-to-people projects to joint business development activities. The Arctic Council includes the US and Canada, in addition to the Nordic countries and Russia. And it is the only circumpolar forum for political discussions at government level. Since its establishment in 1996 as a forum for promoting environmental cooperation, the Arctic Council has expanded its scope to address a wider range of issues. It is, for example, currently exploring how the Arctic countries can best prevent oil pollution in the Arctic waters. This, together with the great significance of the Arctic for the global climate, is one of the reasons why countries such as India, South Korea, China and Singapore have thought and have been granted observer status in the Arctic Council. New opportunities to exploit natural resources, new trade routes, and increasing human activity may have major consequences for the environment and society. And Norway has a great responsibility to ensure sustainable management of the environment and the region's natural resources. The recognition of the vulnerability of the world's gene banks sparked the idea of establishing the Global Seed Vault on Svalbard to serve as a backup storage facility. The purpose of the vault is to store duplicates of seed samples from the world's crops collections. Permafrost and thick rock ensure that the seed samples will remain frozen even without power. The vault is the ultimate insurance policy for the world's food supply, offering options for future generations to overcome the challenges of climate change and population growth. It will secure, for centuries, millions of seeds representing every important crop variety available in the world today. It is the final backup. And it must be said that up to this date, there have only been seeds put into the vault, but I think as of this year there will be a withdrawal. The seeds are the property of the donors putting them in there, and I think the seed coming from the Aleppo in Syria, they have asked to get seeds back now. And then we have the Northeast Passage. Together, the 5 coastal states bordering the Arctic Ocean negotiated a joint declaration in 2014 on the need to develop interim measures to combat unregulated fishing in the Arctic Ocean. The International Maritime Organization is in the process of finalizing a mandatory international code of safety for ships operating in polar waters, which is expected to enter into force in 2017. This is in Norway's interest as a coastal state and flag state. Norway's presence in the High North contributes to security, stability, and predictability in the region. Norway's military presence, combined with that of our allies, is essential in this context. North Norway is a region rich in natural resources with a successful and flexible business sector. The tourism industry has become a year-round industry and is recording continuous growth. The fisheries industry is stable, and the mineral industry, still in the early stages of development, shows great potential. In 2017, the petroleum industry in the north was given a huge boost with the opening of the Snøhvit field. Gas from the Snøhvit is transported by pipeline to Melkøya onshore facility, which I showed you earlier on, where it is processed and cooled to produce liquefied natural gas, which is delivered to markets on specialized LNG carriers. Snøhvit had a major impact on Hammerfest, where 1,200 jobs are now linked to the petroleum industry, but also offers major opportunities for the whole region. Most of the Barents Sea is considered to be a frontier petroleum province, even though there have been exploration activities for more than 30 years. The 23rd licensing round, which was announced in January 2015, includes 54 blocks in the Barents Sea, many of them in previously disputed area west of the delimitation line between Norway and Russia. For the first time for more than 20 years, this licensing round includes completely new and unexplored areas. The Barents Sea is the largest area of the Norwegian continental shelf, covering 313,000 square kilometers. The Barents Sea South has been opened for petroleum activities, but the area's Barents Sea North has not. The only field in production in the Barents Sea today is Snøhvit. The oil field Goliat is under development and is expected to come on stream this year. The work of mapping mineral resources in the north will continue. The government will also strengthen long-term industry-oriented research, for example, in the fields of marine biotechnology and bioprospecting. Research and education in North Norway is an area under continuous development. In 2013, for example, 142 doctorates were awarded, and the 2 universities in the region doubled the number awarded in 2006. Nearly 2,000 foreign students chose to complete all or part of their education in North Norway in 2013. Cooperation between universities, university colleges, and the business sector is well developed and has led to the establishment of a number of small and medium-sized knowledge-based companies, for example, in the field of bioprospecting. The government's aim for Norway is to be a leader in the field of knowledge in and about the high north. More emphasis will be placed on the commercialization of research results. Rapid climate change and increased activity in the north mean that more knowledge is needed. The government will therefore further develop the climate and environmental research being carried out. Norway will further develop the transport system in the north to ensure that it is able to cope with the good flows, everyday transport and tourism in a reliable manner, and can provide good connections between the countries of the north and the global markets. The number of commercial ships sailing through the Northeast Passage is likely to increase as a result of the climate change. This, together with increased petroleum activities, will mean that communication, especially two-way communication services and infrastructure, will have to be improved across the entire region. In 2014, Norway launched its second automatic identification system satellite, which will give us a better overview of shipping activity in the Arctic. It will also provide better overview of the sea during search and rescue operations and other incidents. And it is a useful tool for uncovering illegal fishing activities. Through the maritime surveillance and information system Barents Watch, government agencies that have operated responsibly at sea will be able to share information securely and effectively. The Norwegian Space Center is developing concepts for a satellite communication north of 75 degrees north. And then we have the environmental and emergency preparedness. The Joint Rescue Coordination Center Northern Norway oversees some 80% of Norway's search and rescue responsibility in the Arctic. The vast distances and increasing traffic of activity in the region make it necessary to enhance preparedness and capacity. Due to rapid climate change and increased human activity, it is also vital to develop sound integrated management plans and thorough studies of environmental impacts. Close cooperation between the countries in the north is also important in order to address transnational environmental issues. In spring 2014, the government strengthened preparedness in Svalbard with the leasing of new helicopters. Efforts to establish an oil spill preparedness and response base on the islands of Lofoten and Vesterålen are also underway. The Arctic Council has set up a task force on Arctic marine oil pollution prevention, which is co-chaired by Russia and Norway. Norway is also involved in the work to develop international standards for petroleum operations in the Arctic. Much has already been achieved in the Arctic. Cooperation between research communities, the public administration, and the business sector, both within the region and across national borders, will bring more results in the year ahead. We need to continue to show the world that we take our responsibilities as an Arctic nation seriously. Our main focus will be on the people who live in the region, biodiversity, and sound resource management, and not least on effective international cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to move to our keynote speaker, the Honorable Fran Ulmer. She's the Special Advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State on Arctic Science and Policy and Chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, where she served since her appointment by President Barack Obama since March of 2011. The bio is in the program. I will spare you the rest of the details, except to say that she is definitely in her element when we start talking about the Arctic. So, Fran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here, and I sincerely appreciate the invitation to spend some time with you this morning talking about the Arctic. Let me begin by saying, Ken, we're still talking about building a gas line in Alaska. That has not changed. As a matter of fact, the governor of the state just had a special session on this topic last week. And so some things continue to be in the realm of the hope as opposed to perhaps the possible. But Springs, we do continue to talk about that as a possibility. I would just be curious, how many have been to Alaska? Raise your hand. Oh, significant. This is not your average lower 48 population, let me just say that. And so some of the background information that I provide on the Arctic will probably not be necessary for many of the people in the audience, but I always assume that it's a good idea to actually start with the obvious, perhaps. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Arctic. I'm going to talk about what's changing in the Arctic. I'll talk mostly about oil in the Arctic. And then I will spend a little bit of time on the question of what is the United States policies, the national agenda for the Arctic, and what is happening in the international space. So I'm going to try to do that in about 30 minutes and still save a little bit of time for questions at the end. So as most of you know, what makes the Arctic very special and quite challenging is that it is primarily an ocean surrounded by land. And the land that surrounds the Arctic Ocean is controlled by different countries with different agendas, different laws, and different responsibilities. That, by way of contrast, I might just say, with the Antarctic, a lot of people think of them as the same. It is true that they're both cold, but that's pretty much where the similarity stops. So in the Arctic, think polar bear, think people. In the Antarctic, think penguins and the research community. In the Arctic, think space where national agendas actually have significant interests, both from the standpoint of national security and oil development. In the Antarctic, think international treaties with a focus on peace and science. These are very different places, and I know many of you know that, but on the other hand, to the extent that it's important to emphasize this, particularly when we're talking about questions of development, I think starting with the basics is an important place to start. Now, the United States actually defined the Arctic for purposes of research and policy back in 1984 in the Alaska Initiative, which Senator Murkowski at that time, not Lisa, but her father Frank, introduced and passed. And so the definition of the Arctic in United States law includes the Bering Sea. And that sort of surprises people, but it makes a lot of sense if you're thinking about it from the standpoint of the environment, because the resource and the important environmental issues really are very connected between the Bering Sea and the Chukchi and the Beaufort. So it's an unusual way of thinking about it, but that is the law. Now, because I'm in Texas, I just had to include this slide. This is actually an accurate representation of scale. So 2 Texas fits inside of 1 Alaska. And I say that not to be in any way disrespectful of the state that we are sitting in. I say it and put this up to just illustrate from the perspective of the United States understanding the challenges that one faces in terms of delivering services, in terms of communication, transportation, responding to emergencies, et cetera. It's important to remember the scale of Alaska as well as the location of Alaska. And often map makers in the United States don't do a very good job on either of those things. So when we're talking about actually servicing the Arctic, you look at Barrow at the very, very, very top, and then realize that Kodiak, down, in the middle, is where the large U.S. Coast Guard base is. And think about what it takes to get Coast Guard assets up to Barrow. You begin to see some of the challenges that one faces doing any kind of business, whether it's oil and gas, shipping, responding to a tourism disaster or anything else. There are significant issues. So that's sort of my primer on the Arctic and on Alaska. So let me just shift to what's changing. One of the things that's really changing is how much more attention the world is paying to the Arctic. I mean, look at all of you here this morning. This is an illustration of it in some ways. I mean, 10 years ago, if Rice University would have had a morning session on the Arctic, would you all be here? Maybe not. And part of this is because the media, frankly, has been covering the Arctic in a very different way than it used to do. And that is largely being driven by the dramatic rate of change in the Arctic. The dramatic rate of change in the Arctic isn't just about climate, although many of the things that are now possible in the Arctic actually are a reflection of the changing climate, but it's also because of the really big money issues associated with the climate. So it's global economics as well as climate change that I would argue is really, those things combined have really piqued the curiosity by many people about this region beyond the curiosity that they used to have. So we're going to talk about a number of these. I won't have time to talk about all of them, but obviously oil and gas, we've heard a little bit already about tourism and shipping. I just want to point out mining is also a big deal in the Arctic. It is in Canada, it is in Alaska. The largest zinc mine in the world is Red Dog in Kotzebue, Alaska, which a lot of people don't know. And an emerging tourism, which poses some interesting challenges. So the environment, in terms of both the global economics and the interest in the Arctic and the climate, actually this is happening really fast. And that's another reason I would argue in terms of why there's more media coverage, because it is happening so quickly. It's happening in our lifetimes. In geologic terms, this is an instant, but it is quite dramatic, both from the standpoint of increasing human activity, increasing interest in the national security issues associated with the Arctic space, but largely, again, driven by the fact that ice is in retreat. And ice means at least summertime ice in a pretty dramatic way. You've probably all seen these comparisons. The average 30-year median sea ice extent in the lowest period of ice, that is the summertime. September is summer for purposes of ice management, and the record low in 2012. And of course, there's always variation from year to year. It's never exactly the same. Some years it's a little bit more, some years it's a little bit less, but the 30 to 35-year trend, ever since we have actually had the satellite capacity to look at how much ice is in the Arctic, is pretty dramatic. So roughly, if you want numbers, if you compare now versus the 30-year average, 50% less extent of summertime sea ice in space, 75% less in volume. So it's not only the extent of sea ice, it's the thickness, and it means that we are losing multi-year ice pretty dramatically. That is changing the ecosystem in some pretty powerful ways, which we don't have a lot of time to go into, but here are just two views from the Coast Guard icebreaker Healy, 2007 versus 2012. This was what the Arctic Ocean looked like. Just a flash in time. It is changing dramatically, which means there is more opportunity for access, more access both from the standpoint of shipping, from the standpoint of oil and gas, but also from the standpoint of, from the environment's perspective, a whole new emerging ecosystem. The new ecosystem of the Arctic Ocean is going to look entirely different than it has in the past. And all of the ice-dependent species, including the people of the North, the Inupiat and Yupik and Inuit people who have literally lived in the Arctic for thousands of years, their lives are changing dramatically as well. So this is the tension now between the local people who actually live in the Arctic and the extent to which their lives are changing because they can no longer depend on ice. Now, why do you want to depend on ice? If you have ice cellars in which you store your subsistence-caught food, and those ice cellars are no longer staying frozen, it means you no longer have your freezer operating and you lose your fish and your game and your birds and the other foods that you depend on. If you used to have ice roads in the wintertime that you could drive on, and now you can't count on that anymore, it means you can't drive, can't get to the other villages that you used to be able to get. So there's a whole world that we don't really have a lot of time to go into, but in some very dramatic ways, the world is changing for the people of the Arctic, just as it is changing for the people who have an interest in potential economic development in the Arctic. So let's switch to oil. The Arctic actually has been a place where people have taken oil back south for a long time. Whaling was a really, really big deal back in the 1800s, and oil from the whales actually lit the lamps in Massachusetts. So this is, in some ways, even though it's a very different kind of oil we're talking about, the extent to which the Arctic has been a place of rich resources taken to mid-latitudes is actually kind of a long, long story. The most recent coverage of oil in the Arctic has been driven, I would argue, not only by industry, but by the U.S. Geologic Survey, which did an analysis that basically tried to project how much of the remaining oil and gas left in the world is above the Arctic Circle. And USGS, back in 2009, came up with this estimate that has been often quoted: 13% of the remaining oil, 30% of the remaining natural gas in the world would be in the Arctic. And the darker the shading, the more likely in terms of significant findings of oil, at least according to USGS. And in a recent publication, you will find numbers that sort of try to synthesize that USGS analysis in terms of how much offshore, how much onshore, where is it, both from the standpoint of currently developed fields, but also from the standpoint of where it may be in the future. Obviously, Russia, Canada, US, Norway, there are a number of places where it is anticipated that additional oil and gas development will occur. But how it occurs and how safely that development takes place is part of our discussions this morning. And I would just like to acknowledge it is a pleasure to share the podium and the panel this morning with my Norwegian colleagues, because when I served on the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission back after the disaster in 2010, our commission looked around the world to other countries that do a job of managing risk and taking into consideration the balance between environmental protection and development. And in my opinion, Norway is one of the best, if not the best, in the world, and we learned a lot from the Norwegians as we prepared our report. But there are other places where perhaps things aren't going quite so well, and the expectations about how the variety of the countries of the Arctic might be managing their development is something that needs to be of concern to all of us. So where is the oil? Again, USGS has projected this. Only time will tell. I think an important point to be made is that there's a lot of speculation about how much of this oil might actually be within a country's EEZ or in the extended continental shelf that may be proved up under UNCLOS. A lot of the projected oil and gas resource, at least according to USGS, is actually not in undisputed areas, but in undisputed EEZs, but not in areas where there is a huge amount of dispute. So one of the other ways in which the media often covers the Arctic is that it is a place of controversy, a place of tension, a place where there are a lot of things that could go wrong. Well, I suppose there are a lot of things that could go wrong anywhere, but I would argue in comparison to a lot of places in the world, the Arctic is a pretty good place where countries have done an excellent job of cooperating and working out their differences. And as was already mentioned, the Arctic Council is one of the reasons that that is the case. But other reason that I would just share with you this morning is that where there have been boundary disputes, largely they have been peacefully negotiated and resolved. So this dispute between Russia and Norway, which was resolved a number of years ago in terms of their border, makes it easier, I suggest, in being able to think about how development in the Barents Sea will be able to proceed. If there is an area that is kind of straddling that borderline, Barents 2020, the work that was done between Norway and Russia to work together about how that permitting and how that regulation might take place in this area. Again, an illustration of how countries actually in this region are working pretty well together. This is an area that hasn't yet been resolved between the United States and Canada in the Beaufort Sea, but there's been a lot of discussions about it. I expect that it will be, and there really isn't any insurmountable difference of opinion, and I think particularly if the oil development in this region looks more likely, that just like Norway and Russia, there will be even more incentive for US and Canada to finish our discussions about how to resolve this. So I think there are lots of illustrations about how really this is an area where things are working quite well. So let me take a slightly deeper dive into the US Arctic and the oil and gas development in Alaska. As many of you know, the Department of Interior has leased a number of areas in Alaska, onshore and offshore, over the years. The Chukchi Sea area was a record $2.7 billion bid back in 2008. It is the area, the blue shading off on the left, for those of you that aren't very familiar with it, the Chukchi, and over on the right, the Beaufort. In both areas, the federal government has provided leasing opportunities to the industry. These are the currently active Beaufort Sea leases. The drilling sites, I just want to put the Alaska shore-based development on the screen too, just to kind of get you situated. Prudhoe Bay is, and still actually was at its time and still is today, the largest North American oil field ever discovered. Again, sorry, Texas, but it's true. It still is, and although we are obviously, we have, since oil started flowing in the pipeline in 1977, the amount of oil that is being produced is much less than it used to be when it was flowing freely. But the area around Prudhoe Bay, there have been a number of satellite fields, and that plus increased opportunities from technology like slant drilling, et cetera, has made a lot of things possible, and we continue to have oil flowing down the oil pipeline. The area over on the left, the National Petroleum Reserve, ConocoPhillips is moving forward in that area. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge does not have oil development in it, but there is still a continuing dialogue about whether or not, particularly the 1002 area, should have oil development. The federal government has said no. Many interests in the state of Alaska have said yes, please. So most of the oil development that has taken place in the Alaska part of the U.S. Arctic has been on land, but there is interest in offshore. So I mentioned earlier that I served on the Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Commission after that very sad disaster. And I might just note, even though we were focused on the Gulf of Mexico, and we were focused under our mission from the president to do two things. One, identify what went wrong, and two, make recommendations about how to improve the safety of oil and gas, particularly oil and gas development offshore. So we were focused on the Gulf of Mexico, but we also looked at frontier areas. And the frontier area that was very much being discussed at that time was the Arctic. So in our report, we included a few recommendations regarding the Arctic. And we basically said, you know, when you go forward with this, United States of America, make certain that you are setting the highest possible standards for how you do development in the Arctic, recognizing that it is an extremely vulnerable as well as valuable place, and put in place the necessary precautions that will make it easier if there is a disaster to be able to respond, but primarily concentrate on prevention, because once there is oil in icy waters, it is almost impossible to clean up. So what are the challenges to doing business in the Arctic, whether it's in the U.S. Arctic or any other Arctic? And I do want to agree that there are different Arctics. So the Norwegian Arctic, a lot less ice. Yes, they have big storms in the Norwegian Sea. Yes, they do have storms, and yes, it does get cold and dark. But there are very different kinds of challenges associated with places like the Alaskan or Canadian Arctic, where you have a lot more ice to deal with. Having said that, a lot of what is on this slide applies to much of the Arctic. The long distances, the challenging darkness, the distance from other centers, lack of infrastructure in many places, need for specialized technology, specialized vessels. All of these things increase cost and increase the necessity for both the industry and government to work together to assure a higher level of risk management than perhaps is required in other places. And for the experiences that have been recently covered in terms of the U.S. Arctic, those challenges are not only in the Arctic, but sometimes are trying to get your materials, your equipment, and your vessels back down to Seattle. Clearly, the drop in price in the last year or two has changed the economics associated with oil and gas development everywhere, but particularly in high-cost areas. And that means that as we now look at development in the Alaska region, there has been a game change, and Shell has announced that it did not find what it was looking for in the Chukchi, and it is suspending its exploration program, not permanently, but indefinitely. And ConocoPhillips is proceeding onshore and may or may not be proceeding in nearshore. That depends on a lot of things, and the same is true for Exxon and Statoil and others. I think everyone is evaluating the situation under the circumstances, including the Obama administration. There is also the additional issue that I just want to mention, and that is because people live in the Arctic, the Inuit, the Yupik, the Inupiaq, that are still a subsistence culture. They still rely on whaling and other marine mammals as part of their diet and part of their culture. There are significant protections that are included in federal law for purposes of assuring whale migration routes and non-interference with marine mammals as it relates to not only the health and well-being of the marine mammals, but also the health and well-being of the subsistence local cultures that rely on them. So this is another piece of the puzzle in terms of understanding the challenges. I mentioned that it's very, very difficult to clean up oil in icy waters. And this is another topic that we could spend a whole hour on, but let me just say that the recognition that we weren't spending enough money on research has really changed in recent years. There is more commitment by both the industry and by government and by universities to invest in research that is required to better understand how oil in icy waters might be dealt with from the standpoint of spills, but also from the standpoint of being able to do a better job of preventing them in the first place. There have been a number of reports that have been written in the last 5 or 6 years that focus on what needs to be done. If there's going to be additional investment in this kind of research, what kind is required? How much is being spent now? I would say that because Shell had an interest in moving forward, Shell was unquestionably spending a fair amount on research. So was the federal government, but less so. But I think it was because of a recognition that spending money on understanding the region and understanding the technology that is required in the region is far better than trying to clean up a mess later. Research is also absolutely essential in this region for a variety of other reasons, not just dealing with oil spills, but understanding the resource potential, understanding how you can engage in the activity with having the least footprint and the least negative environmental impact, and understanding how you can deal with it on a long-term basis where you can end up with the accumulation of infrastructure that can have very negative impacts on local culture. So trying to put all of those things into the equation with very little information means that we are flying blind. The alternative is to invest in research. And I guess the good news is in recent years there have been some significant investments. I do hope that that doesn't change as a result of the fact that it looks as though it may be a while before there is actual investment in the development. As you said, better now rather than yesterday in terms of when you need to do the work to prepare. And that kind of preparation, whether you're talking about fishing or mining or shipping or oil and gas or tourism, doing that research is essential. The biggest investor so far has been the oil and gas industry. And I want to acknowledge the fact that the industry not only stepped up to invest in research, but at least in Alaska was willing to share information. So 3 years ago, for the first time, to the best of my knowledge, Shell, ConocoPhillips, and Statoil, in a research partnership, signed an agreement with NOAA to share data back and forth with the research that was being done in the Chukchi and the Beaufort. That was a breakthrough, and I think it actually is a great model for us to think about, that industry research, at least in our country, which has been not so much, it hasn't been as easy to share it, let's just put it that way, and perhaps some of the federal agencies have been a little reluctant to accept that information. I think it's been on both sides of that equation. I think we need to get over that and recognize that better data sharing and research sharing really promotes the kind of understanding on both sides in a way that is really helpful to society. So let me just switch briefly to what kind of research the Arctic Research Commission is promoting, and talk a little bit about the national agenda for the Arctic, and then a little bit about international cooperation, and then I will stop. So the U.S. Arctic Research Commission was created by that same law that defined the Arctic geography for the United States of America back in 1984. The Arctic Research Commission was basically created to shine a spotlight on the areas that Arctic research really was needed to support society, to support both local people in the Arctic, but also decision makers, whether it was the private sector or the public sector. So in our most recent goals report, and there are copies of this somewhere in this building, I'm not exactly sure, but hopefully on your way out of the facilities this morning, there'll be a stack of them and you can grab one and take it with you. We focus on these areas and we talk about in this report how these research areas support important social questions, economic questions, cultural questions, health questions. Because the extent to which Arctic research really enables decision makers to make better choices depends on these basic building blocks: observation systems, an understanding of sea ice and how it is impacting not only the environment, but how it impacts infrastructure. The federal law that created the Arctic Research Commission also created an entity within the federal government. We're outside of the federal government, they're inside the federal government, IARPC, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, which coordinates among the federal agencies the research that is done in the Arctic space. So think NASA, NOAA, Navy, Department of Interior, USGS, et cetera. IARPC coordinates and brings focus together in a 5-year research plan for the investment that the science part of the federal agencies, those that focus on the Arctic, want to bring better efficiency and effectiveness to their research investment. I am telling you that for the people in the audience who are interested in how the Arctic research money that the federal government spends gets coordinated. You might want to go to iarpiccollaborations.org, and actually what's interesting about how IARPC has changed, it is looking for private sector partners. It's looking for universities, as opposed to thinking it's just the federal agencies world. There's actually, the door is open through iarpiccollaborations.org, which I encourage you to look at. So if you are interested in more information about the Arctic Research Commission, go to arctic.gov. The thing I particularly want to draw your attention to on this slide is the Arctic update. For those of you who are actually really interested in the Arctic and want to be able to continue your education on the Arctic, go to arctic.gov and sign up for the daily update. Every single day, it is a snapshot of what is going on in the Arctic. Arctic science, Arctic meetings, recent pronouncements by governmental leaders. What's changed in the Arctic is on the Arctic update every single day. So if you're interested in the Arctic, you want to go to arctic.gov and sign up. So in closing, let me talk about national agenda and the international space. The United States, for a long time, did not focus on the Arctic the way in which other Arctic nations have. What do I mean by that? Norway, Canada, Russia, they think of themselves as Arctic nations. It's part of their national identity. That isn't really true in the United States. If I go to Iowa and say, are we an Arctic nation? Most people are not going to immediately say, of course we are. But that's what you'd find if you were in Norway or in Finland or in Sweden or in Canada. They are Arctic nations in a way that the United States really hasn't been. So what's changed? Well, at the beginning, I started talking about how much more coverage there has been, how climate change and the disappearance of sea ice and the interest in oil and gas development and global economics has really changed the focus. Well, it's also changed the focus from the standpoint of our federal government. So in 2003, the United States adopted an Arctic strategy. This is something that every other Arctic nation had already done. So adopting a national strategy, an implementation plan in 2014, an executive order that created a steering committee to make that implementation plan work in 2015, 2013, 2014, 2015. You see how recent this is? And you see how much more intentional it is than it had been for a long time. As an American and as an Alaskan, I'm very happy about that. But there's still a huge lag in terms of federal investment in the way in which is really necessary to make these strategies and implementation plans real. So I was very, very glad, actually, when President Obama came to Alaska in August of this year for something called the Glacier Conference, which was all about the Arctic and climate change in the Arctic, but it was also about what is it that countries need to do to be prepared for the changes that are taking place. And a number of commitments were made at that time by the president, and we'll see whether or not Congress funds them. So for example, ice-breaking capacity. Finland is a country of 5 million people, and they have 3 or 4 times the number of icebreakers than the United States has. Russia has about 24. We literally have 2. And the extent to which the United States, if it is going to be a serious player in the Arctic, needs to invest in infrastructure is pretty self-obvious. But having said that, icebreakers cost about $1 billion a pop. And so the extent to which Congress is willing to step up on something that isn't an immediate emergency, but rather something that positions us for the future, well, we still have some work to do. Let's just put it that way. But there were a number of commitments made, and hopefully a number of those things will actually come to be. The good news is that the experience of not only coming to Alaska, I think being briefed by the U.S. Coast Guard, by the Navy, the Defense Department, about how incredibly important it is to have assets in this region, has gotten us to yet another place that we need to go, which is a presidential commitment to building more icebreakers. Absolutely essential. So let me talk briefly about the Arctic Council, and then I will sit down. So you've already heard that the Arctic Council is an intergovernmental forum among the Arctic 8 that was created back in the 1990s, basically as a place where the nations of the Arctic can share information, do research together, find areas of common interest, and work together in a positive way. From the very beginning, the 2 main principles, the foundational principles for the Arctic Council have been 2. 1, environmental protection in the Arctic, and 2, sustainable development in the Arctic. That was how it was in the 1990s when it was created. It's still basically the same today. And through the process of working together through the 6 working groups, focusing on big picture questions, bringing people to the table that have expertise, producing reports on everything from climate change to ocean acidification to economic development for telecommunications, it has been incredibly successful as an organization. Every 2 years, the chairmanship changes. So it just was Canada. In April, it switched to the United States, and when the U.S. chairmanship is over, it will pass to Finland. John Kerry is our person at the table. That's the level at which the Arctic Council functions. So the Secretary of State was there in Iqaluit to take over the chairmanship. And every time a country takes over the chairmanship, it proposes an agenda for the 2 years, but the entire Arctic Council has to agree with that agenda. It's a consensus-based organization. So the U.S. agenda for the Arctic Council for these 2 years, 3 themes: Arctic ocean safety, security, and stewardship, improving economic and living conditions of the people of the Arctic, and addressing the impacts of climate change. And those 3 broad categories, under them, there are a number of specific projects. I'm not going to go into it this morning, but if you go to either the State Department or just Google Arctic Council, you will see some of the very specific work projects under those 3 themes. I do want to mention, in addition to the sort of general work, in recent years, very specific work has resulted in agreements among the Arctic 8 that are incredibly important. One dealing with search and rescue, and one dealing with oil spill response. One that will probably be signed before the end of the U.S. chairmanship is one on international cooperation in scientific research, which has been the work of a task force for the last year or 2. And just recently, as in last month, the signing of by the Arctic Coast Guard Forum of a way in which the Arctic nations can, in a very practical way, be able to respond if there's an emergency. So it took the agreement, which everybody signed, and took it to another level of where the practicing capacity and expertise really is. And that is going very, very well. And I might note for those who are questioning in your mind, is everybody working really well in the Arctic, including with Russia? The answer is yes. In this space, there is a significant degree of cooperation, particularly on things of mutual benefit, and here, this is an excellent example of that. The Arctic Council also came up with the Arctic Economic Council last year, which is moving forward. And for those of you who are, again, particularly interested in the economic development potential of the Arctic, you might want to engage with the Arctic Economic Council. It's not part of the Arctic Council. It's like a parallel organization, but it's of interest. So this is my last slide. And I just want to do kind of a brief sum up. As I mentioned, this is a space, this is a region that is undergoing significant change. We see the impacts of a warming climate in the Arctic every single day. But it's not only the warming climate and the retreat of sea ice and the thawing of the permafrost and the coastal erosion and the changing behavior of animals. It is also the global pressures to develop regions like the Arctic where there are significant resources. And so all of this, plus the increased interest by the countries in the Arctic and the countries like China, Korea, Singapore, India, France, that are coming to the Arctic and saying, we're interested too. We don't want to be left out because there may be opportunities here. And, oh, by the way, we do significant research in this region. Germany has been a research powerhouse in the Arctic for a very, very long time. So this change and the opportunity to think creatively in terms of a stewardship responsibility toward a place that is both valuable and vulnerable and incredibly special, but also from a human perspective, how can we as a world think about this place and take advantage of some of its very many rich resources in a way that's responsible. I would argue that to be able to answer questions like that, we need to invest more in science and in research so that we understand the region and understand its challenges in a way that we can prepare for them and reduce risk. And unquestionably, to be able to do that well requires not just government, not just industry, not just academia, not just the NGO community, but all of us working together in ways that really free us from some of the 20th century notions about how we do business. Because otherwise, this region, which is huge and very expensive to do business in, whether you're talking about research or anything else, really requires us to think differently, act differently, work differently, and work together differently. So with that, thank you again for letting me be with you today.
We actually have a few minutes to take a couple of questions from the audience. Should there be? So don't be shy. Yes.
Quoted some numbers from 2009 on how big Prudhoe Bay was. Yeah, that was before they, how big Deepwater was going to be and the Sprayberry. So obviously those are big now, but there's obviously source rock also in Alaska, so they must have shale plays there. Are those in play now also? And do they know how big those are?
There is still a lot of oil and gas opportunity in Alaska, and the industry that has been there for a long time and the industry that has come more recently, continue to express optimism that there will be enough oil and gas, particularly oil. Gas remains challenging, but not because we don't have it, but because of transportation issues, that there will be enough oil to keep the pipeline running for a long time. The question is, given other investment opportunities that the industry might have in other places, given the price of oil, given the shrinking amount of capital dollars available to any of the companies, whether they're big or small, all of those things create a very uncertain world. A very uncertain world, not just in Alaska, but every place. So I'm not in a position, there are probably people in this room who are in a position to do a better job of projecting what the oil future for Alaska is. Again, from an Alaskan's perspective, we, like you in Texas, have been an oil economy for a long time. Since the 70s, it is our principal economic activity. So there is a huge amount of interest by not just government, but lots of people in Alaska to make certain that, to the extent that either making land available, state land, and remember Prudhoe Bay, the biggest oil field ever found in North America, was on state land, not federal land, not private land, on state land. So the state of Alaska, as the owner, took a huge share of the value of that resource, which has meant that, oh, by the way, we do not have an income tax, we do not have a state tax. The state of Alaska basically has run education, transportation, public safety, et cetera, from oil revenues. So, long answer to your question, there's a lot of interest in keeping the oil industry alive in Alaska. There's probably more likelihood that that will happen on land than offshore, just because of some of the challenges associated with offshore development. But nearshore is a slightly different picture, which is a longer story. But at any rate, remains to be seen, and I would say that from the perspective of a longtime Alaskan, there will continue to be a lot of political support in Alaska for additional oil development, particularly if it happens on state land. Yes.
I think I appreciate the picture you've painted of the cooperation between industry, international, academic, et cetera. Have you seen a chilling effect on that cooperation from the sanctions against Russia? Are you seeing fewer meetings or more difficult meetings between your seat in government with industry or with Russia?
Well, unquestionably, the sanctions have impacted oil development in Russia, Exxon, et cetera. You all know that. So that creates a certain level of tension because from the Russian perspective, oil development is a huge part of their economy, a huge part of their international standing, so to speak. And a lot of that is in the Arctic. And they need, forgive me if I'm saying the obvious here, but from their perspective, unquestionably, the sanctions matter, and it has to have some ripple effect. But having said that, if you just look at the work that is being done at the Arctic Council level, you really don't see that. They come to meetings, they participate, maybe, one meeting somebody will show up versus somebody else, but no, they're there. I was in Reykjavik, Iceland last month for the meeting of what's called the Arctic Circle, which has become the largest Arctic meeting, I think, actually anywhere in the world. So 2,000 people in Reykjavik, Iceland for 3 days from 50 different countries. A very large Russian delegation, and they spent a lot of time talking about the Northern Sea Route, which of course would connect Europe around to Asia across Russia. They spent a fair amount of time talking about the investment that they are making in ports, in response capacity, new icebreakers, et cetera, to prepare that Northern Sea Route as an economic alternative to other international routes. So again, from my viewpoint, listening to that presentation, they were projecting an image of we're open for business. Come to the Russian Arctic, come use the North. This is important, not only to us, Russia, but important to Korea, Singapore, China, all kinds of countries that potentially want some of the resources from the Arctic, from Norway, or from any place else. And actually, yesterday, there was an agreement signed between the president of Iceland and the president of South Korea, plans to develop the Northern Sea Route. These two anchors. So again, sorry for the long answers here, but these are complicated questions. There are many things moving. There are many moving parts. And unquestionably, the sanctions and things that are happening between Russia and the US and other members of the Arctic Council create some degree of tension. But in the Arctic space, the principal focus is things are fine here. We want them to stay peaceful. We want to continue to cooperate. It's good for business. It's good for, the long-term for the long term for all of us because we share this region. Maybe one more.
Yeah, one more question.
Yeah, I have a question about continued research funding. Obviously, because of the economic drivers, oil and gas industry has put an awful lot of money into Arctic research. I was curious if the other industries that you mentioned, shipping, fisheries, and tourism, are being approached to support Arctic research that might benefit them in the long run.
Many of the other industries that have an interest in the Arctic do invest in research, but not at the scale of the oil and gas industry, probably for obvious reasons that we don't even need to talk about. Part of it is the way in which these industries are structured. So let's take the fishing industry just as an example. In comparison to super large players in the oil and gas industry, Shell, BP, Exxon, that have the capacity, both in terms of their own in-house scientific research capacity and their funding capacity. The other side of that, fishing industry, lots of small-scale individuals, very small companies, either from the standpoint of catching or processing. They don't have the resources. So the industries are organized very differently. They're capitalized very differently. So they are on a very different playing field, so to speak. Same thing with tourism. Same thing with shipping, by and large. I mean, there are a few very large shippers in the world, particularly containerized shippers, but the kind of work that they need done from a research perspective is entirely different than the kind of work that needs to be done for an oil company to be able to get permits from NOAA or be able to do the geology that's required. So it's just way different. So as I project forward, where's the money going to come from? I think it has to come from enlightened self-interest, thinking about the long term of what we need to know about this region. Some of that from the oil industry, some of that from government, some of that from the universities, some of that from the NGOs. It's a good question. I wish I had a better answer as to where, how much, and how to incentivize it. But from the perspective of both a person who has tried to raise money for research and has seen the benefit to developments that are based on good information versus those that are based on a wing and a prayer, I would say it's in all of our best interests to continue the research funding investment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.